Ma'am, I don't care what that paper says. You're not entering this base. Sergeant Thomas Reed kept one gloved hand on the lowered steel barrier and the other near the radio clipped to his vest, his voice flat enough to sound procedural, sharp enough to make the young private beside him stop breathing for half a second. The woman standing outside Fort Hallberg's main gate did not move. She was not in uniform. She had arrived alone in a yellow cab that had already pulled away, leaving her with one dark leather bag, a folded transfer packet, and a gray wool coat buttoned against the cold Virginia morning. The wind moved across the checkpoint in hard little gusts, snapping the American flag above the guardhouse and pushing loose strands of light brown hair across her cheek. She brushed them back without hurry. Behind Reed, the base was waking up in layers. Diesel engines coughing to life, boots striking pavement, a distant formation calling cadence somewhere beyond the motor pool. To anyone watching from the guardhouse window, she looked like a quiet civilian woman who had come to the wrong entrance before sunrise. Maybe a mother, maybe a contractor, maybe someone who had misunderstood the meaning of restricted access. But her eyes did not search for help. They searched the gate, the cameras, the sight lines, the reflection in the glass, the 2-inch gap beneath the vehicle barrier, and the eastern security camera angled just slightly too low to catch the blind spot near the visitor lane. She saw all of it before Reed finished his sentence. Staff Sergeant Alan Mercer stood to Reed's right, arms folded, studying her packet with a look that had already decided the answer before reading the question. South entrance is for visitors, Mercer said. This checkpoint is for authorized personnel. The woman gave him a calm nod. Then check the authorization code. Her voice was low, controlled, American, with the clean edge of someone used to being heard without needing to raise it. Reed glanced down at the papers again. Commander Grace Whitmore. Temporary Transfer Authority. Department-level clearance. Fort Hallberg Command Assumption. The words were there, printed clean and official, but they did not match the woman in front of him. No escort vehicle. No polished shoes. No aid-carrying folders. No uniform with rank bright enough to make young soldiers straighten their backs. Just a woman in a weathered coat, standing outside his gate as if the cold had no claim on her. Reed's mouth tightened. You expect me to believe a new base commander arrives in a cab? Grace looked past him for one brief second, toward the flag, then back to his face. I expect you to verify credentials before making assumptions. Mercer let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. He picked up her identification card, turned it under the checkpoint light, and noticed a small silver pin tucked inside the fold of her wallet. A trident wrapped around a white rose, no bigger than a dime. Worn at the edges like something carried through years rather than purchased for decoration. Nice pin, he said, not hiding the dismissal in his tone. Grace's eyes shifted to it. For the first time, something in her expression changed. Not anger, not pride, something older and quieter. It cost more than most men are willing to pay. The words settled over the checkpoint with a weight neither guard understood. Reed looked impatient now. A delivery truck idled 20 feet behind her, its driver leaning out to see what was taking so long. 2 soldiers on morning duty slowed their walk, sensing the tension at the gate. Grace remained still, the transfer packet held lightly in her hand, her left wrist exposed where the cuff of her coat had pulled back. A pale scar ran across it, thin and precise, visible for only a moment before the fabric covered it again. Reed saw it, but did not understand it. Mercer saw the pin, but did not recognize it. Neither man knew that the woman they were holding outside the wire had once kept 12 men alive long enough to come home. Neither knew that 2 of those men carried their last names. Reed lifted the radio, eyes still on her. Control, this is Gate 1. I need verification on a walk-up claiming command authority. Grace did not interrupt. She only turned her head slightly, studying the misaligned camera above him. The smallest trace of disappointment crossed her face. Then she said, almost softly, verify it properly. The radio gave only static at first, a dry crackle that filled the space between the guardhouse and the lowered barrier. Grace Whitmore stood on the outside line of Fort Hallberg with her bag at her feet and her transfer packet still in Thomas Reed's hand. She did not look cold, though the morning air carried enough bite to redden the faces of the younger soldiers passing behind the checkpoint. She did not look offended either. That unsettled Reed more than anger would have. Anger was easy to file away as attitude. Panic was easy to dismiss as weakness. but calm made a person harder to measure. Grace looked at the guardhouse window, at the reflection of the road behind her, at the delivery truck idling near the curb. The truck's engine ticked unevenly, and the driver kept checking his mirrors as if the delay had become more interesting than irritating. She noticed that too. Staff Sergeant Alan Mercer tapped her identification card against his palm and glanced again at the small silver trident rose inside her wallet. There was something familiar about it, something he had seen years ago in a photograph his son Noah had kept on a nightstand after returning from overseas. But memory did not open all at once. It stayed behind a locked door, waiting for the right sound. "How long have you been assigned to Fort Hallberg, Staff Sergeant Mercer?" Grace asked without turning her eyes from the checkpoint. Mercer blinked. "You read my name tape." "Yes." "Then you know the answer is in the personnel system." "I asked because I wanted to hear how you answer." Reed looked up sharply. "Ma'am, this is not an inspection." Grace finally looked at him. "Everything is an inspection when a gate is involved." The words were quiet, but they changed the temperature of the moment. A private inside the booth stopped pretending not to listen. Mercer shifted his weight. Reed frowned, caught between annoyance and the uncomfortable sense that this woman was not standing at the wrong gate by accident. Fort Hallberg stretched beyond them in neat rows of brick offices, motor pools, training lanes, and family housing hidden behind winter trees. To the outside world, it was just another American military installation. To Grace, it was a map of vulnerabilities wearing fresh paint. She had studied the base reports for 3 nights before arriving. Delayed maintenance requests, declining morale, a series of small security mistakes described as isolated incidents by people who did not understand that isolated incidents had a habit of forming patterns. She had chosen the cab on purpose. She had chosen the civilian coat on purpose. She had left her formal command uniform folded inside the leather bag at her feet because polished rank often made people behave better than they actually were. Grace had learned long ago that the first truth of a unit was not found in briefings. It was found at the gate, in the chow hall, in the hallway after the senior officers left, in the way people treated someone they believed had no power. The radio crackled again. "Gate 1, repeat the name." Reed pressed the button. "Grace Whitmore. Claims commander-level transfer authority." He glanced at her as he said claims. Mercer heard it. Grace heard it. So did the private in the booth. There was a pause on the line. Too long. Then a different voice answered, lower and more careful. "Stand by." Reed's expression stiffened. Grace watched the change in him with the same stillness she had carried from the moment she arrived. He was not a careless man, not entirely. His boots were clean. His posture was disciplined. His eyes moved constantly. But discipline without humility could turn into a locked door at exactly the wrong time. Mercer opened her packet again and saw the authorization code she had told them to check. This time, he actually read it. His jaw tightened. "Sergeant Reed," he said under his breath, "this code is not regular visitor clearance." Reed did not answer. He was looking at Grace's left wrist, where the sleeve of her coat had slipped back again. The scar there was pale against her white skin, old enough to have healed, clear enough to suggest it had not been easy. Grace noticed his eyes drop to it. She pulled the cuff down, not out of shame, but habit. Reed cleared his throat. "You could have called ahead." Grace looked toward the base again. "Then I would have learned how you treat a commander." Her gaze returned to him. "I needed to learn how you treat a stranger." The line went quiet after the words left Grace's mouth, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had not. Reed stood with the radio in his hand, the black cord stretched tight between his fingers and the guardhouse console. Mercer stared at the authorization code as if the numbers had rearranged themselves while he was not looking. Behind them, Fort Hallberg continued its morning routine, unaware that the first mistake of the day had already been made at the front gate. A bus carrying civilian maintenance workers rolled slowly into the visitor lane and stopped behind the delivery truck. The driver leaned forward, trying to understand why one woman with one bag had frozen an entire checkpoint. Grace turned slightly to clear the lane, giving the driver a polite nod, then returned to the yellow line painted across the pavement. She did not step over it. That detail bothered Mercer. Most people trying to force their way in leaned forward, argued, waved documents, pointed at clocks, demanded supervisors. Grace did none of that. She respected the boundary, even while challenging the judgment behind it. Reed noticed it too, though he would not have admitted it. You said everything is an inspection, Reed said, keeping his tone guarded. Then what exactly are you inspecting? Grace looked at the gatehouse roof, where a thin strip of sealant had peeled loose near the rain gutter. Then she looked at the side mirror of the delivery truck, angled just enough to show the right side of the booth. Habits, she said. Habits become standards. Standards become culture. Culture decides what happens when no one important is watching. Mercer lowered the packet a fraction. The phrase landed too close to something his son Noah had said after coming home from deployment. Noah had been different after Kandahar, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of young man who folded a towel with the same focus he gave a mission brief. Once, during a family cookout in North Carolina, Noah had corrected his little cousin for leaving the backyard gate open. When Mercer laughed it off, Noah had said, "Small things are only small until the wrong day." Mercer had never forgotten the sentence. He had also never known where his son learned it. Grace's eyes moved to him, and for 1 second Mercer felt as if she had heard the memory pass through him. Reed pressed the radio again. "Control, status on verification?" Static answered. Then the careful voice returned. "Gate 1, command office is being notified. Hold position." Reed frowned. Why is command office being notified for a credential check? No one answered immediately. Grace bent down and lifted her leather bag by its handle. The motion was smooth, economical, not rushed. Reed took half a step forward as if she might try to walk through the barrier. She stopped and looked at him. "I am moving my bag out of the traffic lane, Sergeant. Not invading your base." The private in the booth lowered his eyes, embarrassed for reasons he could not fully explain. Reed's jaw hardened. "You have a way of making simple things sound like failures." Grace set the bag beside the concrete post. Simple things often reveal them. The wind shifted. For a moment, the silver trident rose inside her open wallet caught the pale morning light. Mercer saw it again, clearer this time. The trident, the rose, the worn edges. Something opened in his memory, not fully, but enough to make his throat tighten. Noah had kept a small sketch folded inside his Bible after returning home. Mercer had found it once by accident while helping him move apartments. A trident wrapped around a flower. Under it, in Noah's handwriting, were 4 words, "She brought us home." Mercer had asked who she was. Noah had only said, "Someone I hope you never meet at the wrong moment." Mercer looked from the pin to Grace's face. Her expression gave him nothing, but her silence felt heavier now. Reed, unaware of the shift beside him, handed the papers back through the barrier with 2 fingers, as if distance could protect his authority. "Until command confirms this, you remain outside." Grace accepted the papers without touching his hand. "That is your right." Reed nodded once, satisfied for half a second. Then she added, "Whether it was your best judgment is still under review." Reed's last word at the barrier had barely faded when another vehicle rolled up behind the waiting line. This one a black government sedan with tinted windows and a small base decal on the windshield. The driver stopped, saw the delay, and leaned slightly toward his dashboard phone. Grace noticed the sedan, the driver's haircut, the way he checked the mirror before checking the gate. Administrative staff, probably from headquarters, impatient but careful. Reed noticed only the growing line and felt the pressure of watching eyes. Pressure had a way of making a man reveal what he trusted most: procedure, judgment, or pride. He chose pride first. "You understand how this looks from our side," he said, lowering his voice but not softening it. "A civilian-dressed woman walks up before business hours with command paperwork and expects access to a restricted installation. We would be irresponsible not to question it." Grace looked at him evenly. Questioning is not the problem. Mercer's eyes moved between them. The private inside the booth pretended to log license plates, though his pen had stopped moving. Reed took the opening as permission to continue. "Then what is the problem?" Grace glanced toward the eastern camera. "You question the paper more than the code. You judged the code before the credential. You kept one lane blocked while leaving the service lane unobserved for almost 3 minutes. Your camera is angled low. Your second guard is focused on me, not the traffic. Your private has not checked the sedan behind the bus. And your radio call included the word claims before verification was complete." She paused. "Those are the problems." No one spoke. Even the delivery truck seemed quieter, engine idling like it knew to stay out of the conversation. Reed's face changed in small stages, irritation first, then surprise, then the hard mask of a man trying to recover authority in front of witnesses. Mercer looked toward the service lane and saw she was right. A gap had opened near the side entrance while both senior guards had focused on her. It was not dangerous in that moment, not visibly, but it was sloppy. Sloppy was enough. Reed stepped closer to the barrier. "You have been standing here taking notes on my checkpoint." Grace did not blink. "No, I have been standing here hoping I was wrong." That answer struck Mercer harder than an accusation would have. He looked again at the silver trident rose, and the memory sharpened. Noah had once described the person who saved his unit without saying her name. She saw what everyone else missed, he had said. She could stand in a quiet room and still know which door was wrong. Mercer had laughed then, telling his son that sounded like a ghost story. Noah had not laughed back. Now Mercer was looking at a quiet woman outside Gate 1, and the morning air suddenly felt too thin. Reed turned to Mercer. "Run the code again." Mercer stepped into the booth and entered the authorization number directly into the secure terminal. The private shifted aside quickly. A yellow processing bar moved across the screen. Then the system froze. Not denied. Not approved. Frozen. Mercer frowned. "That is strange." Grace heard him through the open booth window. "It is not strange," she said. "It is elevated." Reed looked back. "What does that mean?" Grace's expression remained calm, but her eyes had become sharper. "It means your system is trying to decide whether you are cleared to know what you ask." Mercer swallowed. The private looked up from the screen. Reed almost laughed, but the sound never made it out. The terminal beeped once. Then the booth phone rang. Not the radio. The hardline. Everyone at the checkpoint knew the difference. Radios were routine. Hardlines were not. Mercer reached for it, but before he could answer, the private read the caller identification and stood straighter. "Sergeant Reed," he said, voice suddenly careful. "It is the command office." Reed took the phone himself. "Gate 1, Sergeant Reed speaking." He listened for 3 seconds. His posture changed before his face did. The hand holding the receiver tightened. Mercer saw the color drain slightly from Reed's cheeks. Grace stood outside the barrier, coat moving in the wind, leather bag beside the concrete post, eyes resting not on Reed, but on the flag above him. Reed said only 2 words into the phone. "Yes, sir." Then the line went silent on his end, because the voice from the command office had started giving instructions, and every instruction seemed to make the space around Gate 1 smaller. Mercer stepped out of the booth slowly. The private was no longer pretending not to listen. The waiting drivers were no longer impatient. Reed lowered the phone from his ear and looked at Grace Whitmore, as if he was seeing her for the first time, but still did not yet understand the full cost of what he had missed. Reed lowered the hardline receiver slowly, as if setting it down too fast might make the order more real. His eyes remained on Grace, but the confidence that had held his face together had begun to fracture. Mercer saw it and felt the first cold drop of certainty settle in his stomach. The command office had not asked Reed to detain her. It had not asked him to stall her. It had not asked him to keep her outside until someone more important arrived. It had told him to clear the lane, secure the checkpoint, and stand by for senior command presence. Those were not instructions given for a confused visitor. Those were instructions given when the person at the barrier mattered more than the barrier itself. Reed stepped out of the booth, his boots sounding too loud on the concrete. He still held Grace's identification card, but now he held it with both hands, the way a young soldier might hold something fragile after realizing it belonged to someone far above him. "Ma'am," he began and stopped. The word had changed shape in his mouth. Before, it had been a wall. Now it sounded like a door he did not know how to open. Grace did not help him. She watched the checkpoint, not him, allowing the silence to do what correction often could not. The private straightened near the terminal, face pale with embarrassment. The line of waiting vehicles had grown still. Even the driver of the government sedan had stepped out, one hand resting on the open door, his eyes fixed on the woman outside the gate. Mercer moved closer to Reed and spoke under his breath. "Thomas, what did they say?" Reed swallowed. "Command is coming down." Mercer looked at Grace. For her, Reed did not answer. He did not need to. Grace picked up her leather bag again and moved it another foot away from the traffic lane. The action was small, almost ordinary, but it made Mercer uneasy. She had every reason to be offended, every reason to demand apologies, every reason to use the authority now gathering behind her name. Instead, she kept managing the scene, clearing lanes, watching angles, protecting order even while standing outside the fence that had refused her. That was when Mercer remembered another thing Noah had said, late one night on the back porch, after everyone else had gone to sleep. His son had been holding a glass of sweet tea, staring across the yard, as if seeing a place much farther away. Mercer had asked what made a commander worth following. Noah had answered without hesitation. The good ones do not need the room to know they are in charge. The room figures it out. Mercer had not understood then. He understood now. Reed tried to recover something of his official tone. Commander Whitmore, the command office is sending someone to confirm your arrival. Grace's gaze shifted to him. They have already confirmed it. Reed's face tightened again, but this time not with pride. With shame. Grace continued. What they are sending is a witness. The words moved through the checkpoint like a quiet alarm. Mercer looked toward the road inside the base. In the distance, a military vehicle turned the corner too fast for routine business, but not fast enough to look uncontrolled. A second vehicle followed. The blue and white command placard on the lead windshield caught the morning light. Reed saw it and instinctively straightened. Mercer did too. The private inside the booth nearly knocked his chair backward standing up. Grace remained where she was, still on the outside of the painted line. The barrier stayed down. No one had remembered to raise it. That fact seemed to hang in the air, obvious and humiliating. Grace looked at the steel arm, then at Reed. "Sergeant," she said softly. Reed followed her eyes and flushed. "Raise the barrier." His voice cracked on the first word. The private reached for the control, but Grace lifted one hand, not sharply, just enough to pause him. Everyone froze. "Not yet," she said. Reed stared at her. "Ma'am." Grace looked through the open gate toward the approaching command vehicles. A gate should not open because people are afraid of who someone is. She turned back to the two guards. It should open because the process is correct. Mercer felt the sentence land deep, heavier than punishment. Reed looked down at the identification card, then at the authorization packet, then at the terminal inside the booth where the elevated clearance had locked the screen. For the first time that morning, he followed the procedure without attitude. He verified the card number. Mercer read the authorization code aloud. The private matched the transfer order to the secure notification now blinking on the terminal. Each step took less than 30 seconds. Each step should have been done 5 minutes earlier. When it was finished, Reed stood at attention and faced Grace fully. "Credentials verified, Commander." Grace held his gaze for a moment. "Now raise the gate." The barrier lifted with a low mechanical hum, rising inch by inch until the road into Fort Hallberg stood open in front of Grace Whitmore. No one moved. The delivery truck remained still. The bus stayed behind the line. The government sedan waited with its door open. For a few seconds, the entire gate seemed to understand that access had been granted, but permission had not yet become respect. Grace picked up her leather bag and stepped across the yellow line. It was not a dramatic movement. No one saluted at first because everyone was half a breath behind the moment. Then Reed's right hand came up sharply, followed by Mercer's, then the private inside the booth, then the driver of the sedan who suddenly realized he was witnessing the arrival of Fort Hallberg's new commander. Grace returned the salute with clean precision. Nothing about it was rushed. Nothing about it sought attention. It simply belonged there. The lead command vehicle stopped 10 feet inside the gate, and Colonel Nathan Briggs stepped out before his driver could fully park. He was in his early 50s, square-shouldered, with silver at the edges of his dark hair and the expression of a man who had spent the last 6 minutes learning that a simple arrival had become something else. He walked straight to Grace and stopped at attention. "Commander Whitmore," he said. His voice carried just far enough for the guards to hear. "Fort Hallberg has been expecting you." Grace looked at him. Not at Gate 1. Briggs's jaw tightened. He understood the correction and accepted it without defense. "That will be addressed." Reed stared forward, but the words hit him plainly. Mercer kept his salute until Grace lowered hers. Briggs turned toward the guards, his eyes settling first on Reed, then on Mercer. "Sergeant Reed." "Staff Sergeant Mercer." "Do you understand who was standing outside your checkpoint?" Reed answered with the only sentence he had left. "Yes, sir. Incoming commander of Fort Hallberg." Briggs did not move. "That is the least of it." The air changed again. Mercer felt it before he understood why. Grace's expression remained calm, but her eyes shifted slightly, warning Briggs without words to be careful with what came next. Briggs saw the warning and softened his voice. not for secrecy, but for weight. 5 years ago, during Operation Ashen Harbor, a small joint team was separated from its convoy after a communications failure. 12 service members were cut off in hostile country with no clean route back to friendly lines. He paused. No violent detail followed. None was needed. The men at the gate knew enough about military silence to understand what was being left unsaid. Briggs continued. A commander on temporary attachment refused to leave until every member of that team had been accounted for and brought home. Reed's eyes flickered. Mercer stopped breathing normally. Grace looked past them toward the base, as if the story belonged to someone else. Briggs's voice became quieter. Two of those men were Lieutenant Caleb Reed and Petty Officer Noah Mercer. The names struck the checkpoint like a bell. Reed's face emptied. Mercer turned slowly toward Grace, and the memory that had been locked behind years of partial stories finally opened. Noah sitting on the porch. Noah folding the small sketch of the trident and rose. Noah saying, "She brought us home." Reed's hand lowered from the salute without permission. Not out of disrespect, but because his body had forgotten the order it had been given. "Caleb," he said, barely above a whisper. Grace looked at him then, not as a commander looking at a guard, but as someone who remembered a young officer with dust on his boots, a cracked photograph in his pocket, and a stubborn promise to call his father when he got home. Reed's throat worked, but no apology came out. Mercer's eyes dropped to the silver trident rose in her wallet, still visible for a moment before she closed it. "It was you," Mercer said. Grace did not accept the sentence as praise. She only nodded once. "They did their jobs. I did mine." Briggs let the silence stand because there was nothing else strong enough to replace it. The wind moved across the checkpoint, lifting the edge of Grace's coat and snapping the flag above the gate. Reed looked at the woman he had doubted, the woman he had kept outside, the woman whose name had once sat inside his family like an unanswered prayer. His voice broke, but he forced it steady. "Commander, I did not know." Grace held his gaze. "That is why standards matter, Sergeant. You do not get to know who deserves respect before you give it." Reed stood in the open lane with the weight of Grace's words settling over him, and for the first time that morning, his uniform felt heavier than his gear. He had worn the name Reed over his chest for 22 years, through training posts, overseas rotations, night shifts, family separations, and quiet breakfasts where his wife asked whether their son was safe, and he had no answer. He had believed that experience made him careful. Now he understood that experience had made him certain, and certainty had made him careless. Mercer looked older in the pale light. His eyes stayed on Grace, but his mind had gone somewhere else, to a kitchen table in North Carolina where Noah had once sat with a cup of coffee gone cold between his hands. Noah had never told the full story of Ashen Harbor. He had only spoken in fragments, always stopping before the hardest parts, always saying there were names he was not allowed to share. But he had shared one thing. He had drawn the symbol from memory on the back of an envelope, a silver trident wrapped around a white rose. Mercer had thought it was a unit mark, maybe a joke between men who had survived something they could not explain to their families. He had not understood that the symbol had a face. Now she was standing less than 6 feet away, quiet, white-skinned, wind moving through loose strands of brown hair, carrying the same badge as if it were not a legend but a responsibility. Colonel Briggs turned to Grace. "Commander, we can continue this inside." Grace looked at the checkpoint before answering. The waiting vehicles had not moved. The private was still standing at attention near the terminal. The sedan driver watched from beside his open door. A few soldiers had gathered near the sidewalk beyond the gate, careful not to seem like they were staring, failing completely. In a moment, Grace said. Briggs followed her gaze and understood that she was not finished with Gate 1. Reed stepped forward, his voice low. "Commander Whitmore, may I say something?" Grace turned to him. "Speak." Reed swallowed once. "My son Caleb came home because of you." He tried to keep the sentence formal, but the word son betrayed him. "For 5 years, my family has prayed for the person who made that possible. I had that person standing in front of me, and I treated you like an inconvenience." Grace did not soften the truth for him. "You treated a stranger like an inconvenience." Reed looked down. That correction struck deeper because it removed the comfort of her rank. Mercer removed his cap slowly and held it at his side. "Noah kept your symbol," he said. "He would not tell me your name." He said the best people he ever served with never needed their names spoken first. Grace's eyes changed then, only slightly, but enough for Mercer to see that she remembered his son. Noah Mercer had steady hands under pressure, she said. He also had a terrible habit of apologizing for things that were not his fault. A faint, broken laugh left Mercer before he could stop it. That is him. Grace nodded once. Then you raised him well. Mercer's face tightened, and he looked away toward the flag because gratitude had arrived faster than he could control. Reed saw it and felt his own shame turn into something cleaner, something that might become correction if he let it. Grace stepped closer to the guardhouse window and pointed to the monitor showing the eastern camera feed. This camera is low. That service lane is exposed when both guards focus forward. The visitor delay protocol is unclear. Your private is undertrained for elevated credentials. None of that makes you bad soldiers. It makes this gate vulnerable. Reed straightened. We will fix it. Grace looked at him. No, you will rebuild it. Fixing is what people do when they want the problem to disappear. Rebuilding is what soldiers do when they want the mistake to teach them. Briggs watched without interrupting. He had seen commanders humiliate people in public to make themselves look powerful. Grace did the opposite. She made the truth stand in public and gave the men a way to stand beside it. Reed nodded slowly. Mercer put his cap back on. The private reached for a notebook as if he finally understood that listening was part of duty. Grace turned toward the open road into Fort Hallberg, then paused beside the barrier control. Run the line, she said. Reed blinked. Ma'am, clear the waiting vehicles properly. Check every credential. Reset the service lane. Then brief me on the corrected process before noon. Reed's answer came faster this time. Yes, Commander. Grace picked up her bag. As she walked past him, Reed stepped back and saluted again. This time, it was not because someone had told him who she was. It was because he finally understood what he should have given before he knew. Grace did not look back as she entered Fort Hallberg, but every person at Gate 1 felt the space she left behind. Reed moved first, because duty was easier to understand than regret. He turned to the waiting line, signaled the delivery truck forward, and checked the driver's credentials with a precision that had not been there 10 minutes earlier. Mercer repositioned the second guard to cover the service lane, then stepped inside the booth and adjusted the eastern camera until the blind spot disappeared from the monitor. The private wrote everything down, not because he had been ordered to, but because he had just watched a lesson become permanent. Inside the gate, Colonel Briggs walked beside Grace toward the command vehicle, matching her pace instead of asking her to match his. I owe you an apology, he said. The arrival protocol should have been tighter. Grace kept her eyes on the base road ahead. The protocol worked well enough to show me what I needed to see. Briggs glanced at her. That is not exactly comforting. It was not meant to be. They passed a row of parked tactical vehicles, a maintenance shed with one bay door half open, and a group of young soldiers who straightened as soon as they recognized Briggs. Their salutes came quickly when they saw his posture beside Grace. She returned them without slowing. Fort Hallberg looked orderly at a distance, but distance was where weak commands hid their problems. Up close, Grace saw the small things, a faded safety sign near the fuel point, a clipboard hanging unsecured near a dispatch window, two soldiers laughing near a restricted storage entrance with their backs to the road. None of it was catastrophic. That was what made it dangerous. Catastrophe rarely announced itself on the first day. It arrived wearing small permissions. Briggs opened the rear door of the command vehicle, but Grace did not get in. She looked back toward Gate 1. Reed had stopped the government sedan now. He checked the decal, the identification, the passenger list, and the lane mirror before waving it forward. Mercer watched the service lane while correcting the private's hand position on the scanner. The checkpoint was already changing. Not because Grace had threatened them, because she had made them see themselves. They are good men, Briggs said quietly. Grace nodded. Good men can still build bad habits. Briggs accepted that. He had known Grace long enough to understand that her sharpest judgments were never careless. She did not enjoy finding weakness. She hated that weakness often waited until lives depended on it before revealing itself. Reed and Mercer did not know about Ashen Harbor, Briggs said. Their sons were told parts of it, but the names stayed sealed. Grace's face remained composed, but her hand tightened once around the handle of her leather bag. That was the agreement. You could have let the families know. No, she said. The men came home. That was the point. Briggs studied her profile. The morning light caught the pale scar near her wrist before her sleeve covered it again. You still carry too much of that operation. Grace looked toward the command building at the center of the base. I carry what followed it. That answer made Briggs quiet. Ahead of them, the headquarters flagpole came into view, polished and official, standing in front of a building that had hosted ceremonies, briefings, promotions, and carefully worded reports. Somewhere inside that building were files from the previous command team. Somewhere inside those files were gaps Grace had already noticed before setting foot on base. A convoy route changed without explanation. A communications delay labeled equipment error. A roster adjustment signed by an officer who had retired too suddenly. Ashen Harbor had brought 12 men home, but it had also left behind a question no one at Fort Hallberg had wanted to ask out loud. Grace finally stepped into the command vehicle, setting her leather bag beside her feet. Briggs got in on the other side. As the vehicle began moving toward headquarters, Gate 1 receded in the rear window. Reed stood outside the booth, watching the vehicle disappear down the road. Mercer stood beside him, the two fathers silent in a way only fathers could be. Reed spoke first. Caleb used to say he owed his life to someone who hated being called a hero. Mercer watched the road. Noah said the same. Reed looked at the corrected camera feed through the booth window, then at the open gate. We almost missed her. Mercer's voice was low. No, Thomas. We did miss her. He put his cap back on and turned toward the next vehicle. Now we make sure it never happens again. Down the road, Grace Whitmore looked through the windshield at Fort Hallberg's headquarters and saw not a command post, but a question waiting behind glass doors. By the end of that morning, the base would know she had arrived. By the end of that week, someone would know why. The command vehicle stopped in front of headquarters, and for one quiet second Grace Whitmore stayed seated, looking through the windshield at the glass doors, the polished brass seal, and the two flags moving in the clean morning wind. Fort Hallberg looked proud from the outside. Most places did. Grace had learned that pride was easy to hang on a wall and harder to live at a checkpoint. Colonel Briggs waited without speaking. He knew better than to rush her. Grace reached down, opened the side pocket of her leather bag, and removed a flat black folder sealed with a narrow strip of red tape. No title, no label, only the small mark in the corner, a silver trident wrapped around a white rose. Briggs saw it, and his expression tightened. You brought the Ashen Harbor file. Grace slid the folder back into the bag. I brought the part that was missing. Briggs looked toward headquarters. You think the missing part is here? Grace opened the vehicle door. I know the first lie started here. She stepped out before he could answer. The soldiers near the entrance straightened as she approached, and this time the salutes came before anyone had to be told. Grace returned each one, not grandly, not coldly, but with exact respect. That was what unsettled people about her. She gave respect with precision, and when she withheld approval, they felt the difference. Inside the lobby, the floor had been recently polished, the unit photographs aligned, the trophy case dusted for the new commander's arrival. Still, Grace noticed the corner nobody had prepared, a bulletin board with outdated emergency numbers, a visitor log left open on the desk, and a security clerk who closed a browser window too quickly when he saw Briggs enter. Grace did not stop. Not yet. She walked past the front desk, past the portraits of former commanders, past a framed motto that read "Honor begins with accountability." Her eyes stayed on that motto for half a second longer than anyone else's. Upstairs, the senior staff had gathered in the conference room. Some knew her record. Some knew only rumors. Some expected a speech. Grace gave them none. She set her leather bag on the table, unbuttoned her gray coat, and stood at the head of the room in plain civilian clothes while officers in pressed uniforms waited for her to explain herself. At 0640 this morning, she said, Gate 1 failed a basic command access test. No one moved. It also revealed correctable weaknesses in credential verification, lane discipline, camera placement, and professional judgment. Colonel Briggs stood near the wall, silent. Grace let her gaze move across the table. Sergeant Reed and Staff Sergeant Mercer will not be used as scapegoats. They made the mistake in public because the culture allowed the mistake in private. That sentence changed the room. A major near the far end looked down at his notebook. A captain stopped tapping his pen. Grace continued. By 1200 hours, I want a full checkpoint review. By 1600 hours, I want every department to submit one standard they have allowed to drift. Not 5. 1. The one they hope I do not notice. She paused, and the silence became work. We will start there. No one asked whether she had the authority. The question had already died at the gate. After the meeting, Reed and Mercer arrived at headquarters with their corrected process brief. They stood outside her office like men waiting for judgment. Grace read their report, marked 3 lines, and handed it back. Better, she said. Reed exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since sunrise. Mercer looked at the mark on the folder inside her bag and spoke carefully. Commander, my son once said the person who saved them never wasted a second on revenge. Grace looked up. He was right. Reed's voice was quieter. Then what do you call this? Grace closed the report. Correction. She stood and looked through the office window toward Gate 1, now small in the distance but clear under the corrected camera angle. Revenge looks backward. Correction protects what comes next. The 2 men absorbed that like an order and a mercy at the same time. When they left, Briggs entered and closed the door behind him. The staff is nervous. Grace removed the black folder from her bag and placed it on the desk. Good. Nervous people pay attention. Briggs looked at the red seal. And the person who buried the Ashen Harbor discrepancy? Grace rested her hand lightly on the folder. They paid attention too. That is why they hid it in a place everyone respected too much to question. Outside, the noon flag snapped above Fort Hallberg, bright against the Virginia sky. At Gate 1, Reed checked each credential without rushing. Mercer watched the service lane. The private adjusted the monitor and caught the blind spot before it returned. The base had not changed completely, not in one morning. But something had begun. A quiet woman had been stopped at the gate, and the gate had become a mirror. By sunset, the story would move through barracks, offices, motor pools, and family housing. Some would tell it as embarrassment. Some would tell it as legend. Grace Whitmore would tell it only one way. The first standard had been tested, the first weakness had answered, and Fort Hallberg had finally started listening.